Welcome to anyone who is visiting us. It's great to have you here with us at St. Mary's. In our gospel today, we hear about the story or this encounter of Jesus with this man who was born blind and how Jesus healed this man who was born blind. And strangely, when Jesus and his disciples approached this man, they asked Jesus the question, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" It seems like such a strange question. Why would you ask that? But in the time of Jesus, it was a common belief that if you had some sort of disability or illness, it was because of you or your parents had committed some sort of sin. And your illness or your disability was a consequence of that sin. And so the disciples are making an assumption. They assume that someone had disobeyed God. Someone was to blame for this man to have been born blind and to have been in his current predicament. But what is Jesus' response? He says, "Neither he nor his parents sinned. It is so that the works of God might be made visible through him." In other words, Jesus is saying, look, no one sinned. No one is to blame. The man was just born blind. And when Jesus told them that God was going to bring about a greater good through this man's blindness, what was the greater good? Well, we know, obviously, the man now was able to see. But the greater good was the man's soul. The healing of his blindness led him to have the eyes of faith, to not only see Jesus physically, but to see him with the eyes of faith and to believe in Jesus. And not just to believe in him, but to then stand up for Jesus, to be ridiculed and even thrown out because of Jesus. And no one could tell him otherwise. And yet our gospel reading today and the world in which we live reminds us of a reality that can be very difficult to grasp and understand. If God is love, then why are so many bad things happening to good people? This is the mystery of suffering. Now, we have to remember that suffering is not part of God's original plan for we human beings. When you go back into time, when you go back to the Garden of Eden, when you look at the creation of man and woman, sin, suffering, and death were not originally present. That was, or this is, our world today is a consequence of the fall of Adam and Eve. When they chose to disobey God, original sin, their first sin, brought about a significant change for us. Now we encounter suffering. Now we encounter death. Now sin is present in the world. But with that said, we have to remember that God does not will suffering upon a person. It's not like he looks around each day thinking, I wonder who I'm going to just take my thumb and, kind of grind into the ground. He doesn't operate that way. That isn't God. He only permits or allows suffering to happen. That's why we hear in the book of Wisdom, God did not make death, nor does he rejoice in the destruction of the living. Okay, but if God is love, then why does he permit suffering to happen? And there's at least two reasons why God permits suffering or allows suffering to happen. Again, in the fallen world in which we live, where suffering is now prevalent. First, he allows or permits it to happen because he respects our freedom so much. If we didn't have freedom, we would be just like robots, being controlled by him. We wouldn't truly be able to love because love is not forced. It's freely chosen. And we can see that when God allows or respects our freedom, sometimes we abuse that freedom. Some of the suffering in our world today, much actually of the suffering in our world today, is self-inflicted by the choices, the choices or the sins that we commit. But then there's suffering, we all know that there's suffering where no sin is involved, like the blind man today, an innocent person. And so why does God permit or allow suffering to happen when the innocent are at stake, when the innocent suffer? So secondly, God permits suffering to happen because in a mysterious way, and oftentimes we can't see the full picture, in a mysterious way, God allows or permits suffering because even in the worst of suffering, God can bring about a greater good. The worst thing that happened in human history was that God entered into time and became like us in all things but sin. He became man, he humbled himself, he became vulnerable, and we human beings put him to death. That's the worst thing that happened in human history. But this led to the greatest thing that ever happened in human history. Our redemption, our salvation. He saved us. By his death on the cross and by his rising on the third day, he saved us. He reopened the gates of heaven, and he gave us the opportunity and the real possibility for eternal life with him in heaven. Jesus didn't want to suffer. He didn't want to die on the cross. He knew how dreadful that was going to be. This is why in the agony in the garden, in Gethsemane, what does he pray? He prays, Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me, and yet not my will, but your will be done. Jesus allowed it to happen to him for a greater good. He accepted it out of love for you and for me. And Jesus knows what suffering is all about. He faced it firsthand for you and for me. And so even in the worst of suffering, God can bring about a greater good. Now that's easy to say when things are going well, but that can be very hard to believe when we're eating our way through life, when we're encountering such great suffering, when there doesn't seem to be any end to the suffering. This past summer on July 12th, some of you may have watched a particular audition on America's Got Talent by a 19-year-old woman named Amanda Mamana from Trumbull, Connecticut. And as Amanda walked onto the stage, and as the judges began to ask her just some preliminary questions before she began her audition, it became quickly apparent to everyone there and everyone watching that this young lady was carrying a particular cross. For many years, Amanda had struggled with a speech impediment, and she still stutters when she talks, and so much so that what would take us a few seconds to say a simple sentence takes a great deal of effort and concentration for her. It's been a difficult, very difficult, embarrassing, and challenging road for her. But in God's providence, Amanda discovered at a fourth grade talent show at her school that she doesn't stutter when she sings, and it gave her hope. Over time, she taught herself how to play the acoustic guitar with free lessons on YouTube, and she began writing songs about her life. And so on July 12th on America's Got Talent, Amanda Mamana shocked the judges, she shocked the audience, and everyone watching at home as she went from struggling to say a single sentence to flawlessly singing and playing a song. It was so moving that she received a standing ovation that night, and her audition has been viewed by over 7 million people on YouTube and other platforms. And since then, she's received countless messages from people thanking her for her courage and her inspiration and for being a beacon of hope for them in the midst of their suffering. She was interviewed after her great moment on America's Got Talent, and this is what she said: "For a long time, because of my speech, I always felt ashamed and like I could never be anything or do anything. When I finished and they all stood up, it made me realize that my speech doesn't have to be a handicap for me if I don't let it. My whole perspective of myself and on God changed. I used to shake my fist at God because he was allowing me to have this speech impediment," she says. "But being on the show opened my eyes and allowed me to see that he allowed it for a good reason." In the end, it's true. Due to the fall of Adam and Eve, all of us experience suffering. Amanda, the blind man, you and me. And the question of why still goes unanswered oftentimes. Why me? Why now? Why this? Why him? Why her? Often I don't get to choose the crosses that come my way, just like the blind man or Amanda Mamana. But I can choose how I respond to them. Do I accept the crosses that come my way? Do I not unite myself to Jesus in that cross? And do I offer that for others? Because that's exactly what Jesus was doing for us on the cross, offering it out of love for you and for me. Or do I reject the crosses that come my way and become bitter and resentful? Someone once said, the worst or the most painful suffering is the suffering we reject. And there's a lot of truth to that. I'm not saying that by offering up our suffering, it's easy. It's not. But it gives us purpose. It allows us to unite ourselves to Jesus in the cross. So even in the worst of suffering, God can then bring about a greater good. Sometimes that's hard to see and even harder to believe in the present moment when we're literally going through hell. And so let's not forget why Jesus came. Let's not forget why he endured the cross for you and for me. He wants and desires the absolute best for us. And the absolute best for us is the kingdom of heaven. That's what we've been created for. And so in the midst of our crosses, in the midst of the suffering, let's continue to unite ourselves and keep our eyes on Jesus and on where we're going. The kingdom of heaven for you and for me.